The first wave of the stench hit David Henderson like a physical blow, an almost tangible assault, the moment he wrenched open his car door. It was a grotesque, primal miasma, a smell of raw, undiluted decomposition that clawed at the back of his throat and made his eyes burn with an acrid sting. It was an inherently catastrophically wrong smell for any civilized place, let alone this quiet, sun-dappled residential street directly in front of his mother's small, meticulously lovingly kept house. It was a scent he had on rare, terrible occasions, encountered in the grimmest, most challenging aspects of his extensive city work, an olfactory siren heralding profound systemic failure and unseen dangers, but it had no conceivable place here. A sickening, ice-cold premonition twisted violently in his gut, sharp and immediate. He'd been on his way for his regular Tuesday dinner, a cheerful, light-hearted call from his mother Eleanor, just an hour or so ago, confirming their plans, her voice bright with genuine anticipation for their weekly Scrabble game and his company. Nothing, absolutely nothing in her tone had hinted at anything amiss. He broke into a sprint towards the house, his heart instantly hammering against his ribs like a trapped bird. The appalling smell intensified with every desperate step, becoming thick, cloying, and olfactory scream of profound violation that seemed to coat his lungs. And then he saw it, the visual horror confirming the olfactory assault. A dark, viscous, sickening tide was seeping from beneath the pristine white front door, staining the immaculate paint of the porch steps, a filthy brown, pooling in a grotesque, spreading slick on the manicured lawn, where his mother's prize-winning multicolored petunias usually bloomed in vibrant, joyful defiance of conformity. It was unmistakably, horrifyingly raw sewage. Not just a backed-up drain, not a simple plumbing mishap. This was a deluge, an impossible, overwhelming flood of pure filth. He fumbled frantically with his keys, his hands shaking so badly he could barely fit the key into the lock, then shoved the door open with a desperate heave. The sight that greeted him, the scene that unfolded within, would be seared into his memory, a recurring nightmare for the rest of his days. The small, usually welcoming foyer, a space normally filled with the comforting, familiar scents of lemon-polished old books and the faint, sweet aroma of his mother's baking, was a swamp. Filthy, opaque water, thick with fecal matter, discarded hygiene products, and other unidentifiable, repulsive debris, lapped malevolently against the delicate, floral wallpaper, staining it with greasy, dark tide marks. A cherished, antique Persian rug, a precious gift from his late father to his mother, was completely submerged, its intricate, vibrant patterns obscured by a thick, clinging layer of putrid, reeking sludge. And from the direction of the living room, he heard a sound that tore through his already frayed nerves. His mother's voice, thin and reedy, choked with racking sobs and a desperate, repetitive, almost mindless prayer. "Oh dear God, no, please no. Make it stop. Please make it stop." He plunged recklessly into the disgusting mess, the vile, surprisingly cold water instantly soaking his shoes and trousers to mid-calf, the stench now so overpowering it threatened to make him gag. He found Eleanor huddled on the small landing of the narrow staircase just precariously above the slowly advancing waterline, her small, frail frame trembling uncontrollably, her face ashen with sheer terror and utter disbelief. Her worn, comfortable slippers, her reading glasses, a single dropped knitting needle with a trail of soft blue wool, small, pathetic, everyday islands in a rising sea of indescribable filth, lay scattered on the steps just below her mute testament to the suddenness of the catastrophe. "Mom!" He waded heavily towards her, his own voice hoarse, with a mixture of fear and rising fury. "Mom, what on earth happened? Are you all right?" She looked at him, her eyes wide, unfocused and vacant with profound shock. "David! Oh, David, it came so fast, so fast." From the bathroom, the kitchen sink, the laundry drain, everywhere at once, the smell, the awful smell. I truly thought the whole world was ending. Tears streamed relentlessly down her wrinkled cheeks, carving pale paths through the fine dust of her bewilderment and the grime that had somehow spattered her face. He reached her in a few more splashing strides, pulling her gently into a hug, trying to shield her small body from the horrifying sight of her destroyed home, from the overwhelming reality of what had so cruelly invaded her sanctuary. His mind, usually so quick to analyze, to categorize, to find logical explanations, and formulate solutions, even in the face of utter chaos. A crucial skill honed by years of navigating complex city regulations, overseeing infrastructure projects, and dealing with public safety crises, was reeling, struggling to process the sheer scale of this. This wasn't a simple pipe burst. This wasn't an accidental municipal overflow. The sheer volume, the pervasive targeted horror of it, spoke of something far more sinister, something deliberately, maliciously catastrophic. As he held his trembling mother, his gaze swept with dawning horror over the escalating devastation. The water level was still slowly, inexorably rising. He had to get her out of there immediately. He had to find a way to stop this nightmare. His professional instincts, the ones ingrained from years of dealing with municipal systems and their potential failures, began to flicker fitfully amidst the overwhelming personal horror. Mainline blockage. Possible. But the localized intensity was unusual. Municipal system-wide overflow. He would have heard alerts, seen other signs in the neighborhood, or something else entirely. Something targeted, something engineered. A cold, hard knot of terrible suspicion began to form, coalescing around a single chilling name. Ms. Vogel. Henrietta Vogel. The name surfaced in his mind like a particularly noxious piece of refuse, floating in the toxic tide now consuming his mother's home. Eleanor Henderson had lived in the small, charming, blue-shuttered house on Elm Street for nearly 50 years. She and David's father, Michael, had bought it as starry-eyed newlyweds, filled its rooms with laughter, love, and the comforting, predictable rhythms of a life well lived. They had raised David there, marking his height on the kitchen doorframe, celebrating birthdays with lopsided homemade cakes, comforting him through childhood illnesses in the small, sunny bedroom upstairs. After his father passed away peacefully a decade ago, David had worried constantly about her being alone. But Eleanor, despite her grief, was remarkably resilient, fiercely independent, and deeply rooted in her home and community. Her house was her castle, her meticulously tended garden, her vibrant kingdom. She knew every creak of the floorboards, every idiosyncratic gurgle of the old plumbing, every single bloom in her riotously colorful, lovingly tended flower beds. It was a modest home, perhaps a little old-fashioned and quaint, compared to some of the newer, significantly larger and far more architecturally aggressive houses that had begun to spring up in the rapidly gentrifying Willow Creek Estates neighborhood. But it was hers, a cherished bastion of precious memories and quiet, unassuming contentment. David worked for the city, a multifaceted role he usually described vaguely to acquaintances as infrastructure compliance, urban development oversight, or environmental safety management. In truth, his responsibilities were extensive, involving a labyrinth of regulations, countless site inspections, and an intimate, often unwelcome knowledge of the city's complex underbelly. Its aging water mains, its sprawling sewer networks, its intricate waste disposal systems, and the myriad ways they could and often did fail or be compromised. It wasn't glamorous work, far from it, but it was absolutely essential, and he took a quiet, profound pride in his role in protecting the public from unseen hazards and ensuring the functional integrity of the city they all depended on. He visited Eleanor several times a week, helping with heavier chores, sharing meals, his steady presence, a comfort to her, her unwavering affection, and simple home-cooked meals, a much-needed balm to him after long, often frustrating days, navigating bureaucracy and confronting negligence. The first sign of serious trouble, the first truly discordant note in their otherwise peaceful, predictable existence, had been the relatively recent arrival of Ms. Henrietta Vogel as the newly elected and self-importantly proclaimed HOA president. Vogel lived 3 houses down from Eleanor in a sprawling hypermodern edifice of stark glass, brushed steel, and forbidding gray concrete that seemed to actively sneer at the older, more traditional human-scaled homes surrounding it. She was a woman of sharp, unforgiving angles. In her architecture, her personal style, and her personality, and even sharper, often cutting pronouncements. She possessed an unshakable, almost messianic belief in her own superior taste and infallible judgment, coupled with an almost fanatical zeal for imposing her rigid, minimalist vision of a perfect Willow Creek Estates on everyone else, regardless of their own preferences or history in the neighborhood. Almost immediately upon her ascension to HOA power, Eleanor, with her quaint cottage and vibrant, slightly unruly garden, became a primary target for Vogel's reforming zeal. It started with seemingly small, petty things, insidious little jabs. A politely worded but unmistakably critical typed note slipped into Eleanor's mailbox about the overabundance and chaotic arrangement of flowers in her front garden, suggesting a more streamlined, contemporary, and minimalist aesthetic would be more in keeping with the neighborhood's evolving standards. Shite. A formal complaint logged with the HOA about the cheerful sky blue color of Eleanor's mailbox, which apparently clashed visually with the newly mandated and exceptionally drab HOA color palette of beige, gray, and taupe. Eleanor, a gentle woman who had never had a cross word with a neighbor in her entire life, was bewildered, deeply hurt, and increasingly anxious. She just seems to dislike everything about my house, David. Everything I love, Eleanor had said, her brow furrowed with genuine confusion and distress after receiving a formal notice, complete with a threatened fine about her delicate glass wind chimes, creating unacceptable levels of ambient noise pollution. It's like she wants me to tear it all down, every last flower, every memory, and build one of those sterile, empty boxes like hers. David had initially tried to reassure her to dismiss Ms. Vogel as a harmless, if officious, eccentric, a petty local tyrant, drunk on a tiny sip of HOA power. He'd even reluctantly attended an HOA meeting on Eleanor's behalf, hoping to reason with Ms. Vogel to calmly and politely explain that his mother was an elderly long-term resident who found immense comfort and joy in her familiar surroundings, her garden, her small personal touches that made her house a home. Ms. Vogel had listened to his carefully worded appeal with an expression of glacial, polite disdain, her thin, bloodless lips curved into a smile that didn't come close to reaching her cold, assessing, pale gray eyes. During that meeting, David had found himself in Vogel's cavernous, minimalist living room as she'd insisted on a pre-meeting consultation. The room was a monument to expensive, uncomfortable-looking modern furniture and stark white walls devoid of any personal warmth. Yet, on a low glass and chrome table amidst artfully arranged design magazines, David had noticed a single jarringly out-of-place object, a small antique wooden box, its dark varnish crazed and peeling, in places with one corner visibly water-damaged, the wood swollen and discolored. It seemed like a relic from another life, another world, carelessly dropped into this sterile, modern landscape. Vogel had noticed his gaze lingering on it, and had quickly, almost reflexively swept it into a drawer, her expression momentarily tightening. The incident was fleeting, but it lodged in David's mind as an odd incongruity. "Mr. Henderson," she'd said at the public HOA meeting later, her voice smooth as silk, but laced with condescension, "while we certainly appreciate your mother's, long tenure in our community, progress cannot and will not be halted by mere sentimentality. Willow Creek Estates is evolving, Mr. Henderson. We are striving for a certain standard, a level of sophistication and aesthetic uniformity that ultimately benefits all property owners by enhancing property values." She paused, her gaze sweeping the room. Those who are unable or perhaps simply unwilling to adapt to these enhanced standards may regrettably find themselves increasingly uncomfortable in our revitalized community. The veiled threat, delivered with such polished composure, had been unmistakable, chilling the room. The inciting incident, the moment David realized with a jolt that Ms. Vogel was far more than just a neighborhood nuisance, that she was actively, calculatingly malicious, came a few weeks later. Eleanor had a magnificent old climbing rosebush by her porch, a fragrant, sprawling giant with vibrant crimson blooms that had been a cherished gift from her own mother decades ago. It was without exaggeration her pride and joy, a living link to her past. Ms. Vogel, citing a newly minted and highly suspicious HOA bylaw regarding invasive species, overgrown shrubbery, and plants exceeding predetermined height restrictions, issued a formal, legally intimidating order for its complete removal within 7 days. The order was accompanied by a threat of a hefty daily fine for noncompliance. Eleanor was utterly devastated, heartbroken. David, surely she can't do this. It's my mother's rosebush. It's been here longer than most of these new houses." Tears had welled in Eleanor's gentle blue eyes, and David had felt a surge of protective fury. He'd been incandescent. He'd meticulously researched the supposed bylaw, finding it vaguely worded, overly broad, and almost certainly pushed through by Vogel and her small clique of allies without proper community consultation or a legitimate vote. He'd written a formal, detailed appeal, citing the lack of due process, the arbitrary nature of the ruling, and the rosebush's historical significance to the property. Vogel had responded with a curt, dismissive letter, not only rejecting the appeal outright, but also doubling down on the fine and shortening the deadline for removal. The rosebush, she'd declared with cold finality in her letter, was a visual blight on the neighborhood's enhanced and carefully curated visual harmony, and its thorns posed a potential safety hazard to passers-by. The protracted battle for the survival of the rosebush had been the first major skirmish in what was rapidly and alarmingly escalating into a relentless war of attrition. David, leveraging his knowledge of municipal codes and appeals processes, had managed to get a temporary injunction from a sympathetic local councilman who knew Eleanor stalling Vogel's immediate order. But the experience had left Eleanor profoundly shaken, her fundamental sense of security in her own home deeply eroded. She started to second-guess everything she did, constantly worrying about what innocuous aspect of her life or home Vogel would target next. The joy seemed to be draining from her. The rising action of Ms. Vogel's insidious campaign of terror then began with a series of escalating harassments, a death by 1,000 cuts. She would make a point of patrolling slowly past Eleanor's house several times a day, her eyes scanning critically for any perceived infraction, however minor, a small, vindictive, almost predatory smile playing on her lips. She'd leave anonymous typed notes, unsigned, but clearly in her distinctive, overly formal style, filled with petty nitpicking complaints, a slightly crooked fence post that Eleanor hadn't noticed, a tiny patch of clover daring to appear in the lawn, the unpleasant and potentially unsanitary odor of compost emanating from Eleanor's small, well-tended vegetable patch at the back of the garden. She started spreading insidious rumors among the newer, more impressionable residents that poor old Eleanor was becoming senile, that she was letting her property fall into disrepair, that she was in hushed concerned tones, a borderline hoarder. The first truly shocking detail, the one that demonstrated with chilling clarity Vogel's willingness to actively cause significant harm, occurred when Eleanor's ancient wheezing furnace finally gave out completely in the middle of a particularly brutal January cold snap. David had immediately called a reputable, long-established HVAC company, a family-owned local business he'd used before for his own home and knew to be reliable. The repair crew arrived promptly ready to install a new energy-efficient unit. Ms. Vogel had materialized on Eleanor's doorstep, as if summoned by a dark magic, brandishing a thick HOA rulebook, loudly claiming the proposed furnace unit, which was of course to be installed inside the house, was not on the approved list for exterior appearance and permissible noise levels, a blatant, outrageous fabrication, as interior furnaces had absolutely no such HOA restrictions. She then physically blocked the technician's access to the exterior utility meter, her voice rising shrilly as she threatened to call the police and sue both the HVAC company and Eleanor for attempting unapproved and non-compliant modifications. The bewildered, intimidated crew, unwilling to get embroiled in a protracted and potentially litigious neighborhood dispute, had packed up their tools and left, apologizing profusely to a shivering, distraught Eleanor. David had been incandescent with a rage so profound it left him trembling. He'd spent hours on the phone first with the city permit office, who confirmed, as he already knew, that no such HOA approval was needed for an internal furnace replacement, then with other, more reasonable but clearly intimidated HOA board members who all seemed terrified of Vogel and utterly unwilling to challenge her autocratic pronouncements. It took him 2 precious frigid days while his mother huddled under layers of blankets, her health visibly suffering from the unrelenting cold and mounting stress, to find another company willing to do the work. He ended up having to arrange for them to come at dawn, essentially sneaking them in before Vogel was typically about to avoid another confrontation. Vogel had effectively, and with chilling callousness, weaponized the HOA rules, whether real or entirely imagined, to deprive an elderly, vulnerable woman of essential heat in the depths of winter. During one of his frantic calls trying to find a workaround, he'd spoken to an older HOA board member, a Mr. Henderson no relation, who in a hushed voice had mentioned something odd about Vogel. "She's always been particular since she moved here after that trouble up north," Something about a flood, I think. Lost everything. Makes a person intense, I suppose. The comment was vague, quickly dismissed by Mr. Henderson himself, but it stuck with David another peculiar piece of the Vogel puzzle. The second shocking phase of Vogel's calculated escalation involved a more insidious, long-term, and financially ruinous strategy. She began to complain loudly and persistently at HOA meetings about the aging and potentially hazardous infrastructure in their older section of Willow Creek Estates, specifically and repeatedly targeting the homes, like Eleanor's, that predated the newer developments. She spoke with feigned concern about imminent risks of potential plumbing failures, catastrophic sewer line collapses, and the collective financial responsibility the entire community would bear if such failures were not preemptively addressed. She then formally proposed mandatory and ruinously expensive video inspections, and if deemed necessary by her chosen contractors, full replacements of private sewer laterals for all homes over 40 years old, a measure clearly and cruelly aimed at forcing out long-term, often elderly residents like Eleanor, who were on fixed incomes and could not possibly afford such massive, unexpected expenditures. She even had the audacity to suggest with a look of feigned sympathy towards where Eleanor usually sat, though Eleanor had stopped attending by then, that Eleanor's sadly neglected property was likely the source of mysterious foul odors that Vogel alone claimed to detect periodically, odors no one else in the vicinity ever seemed to notice. David, his professional antennae now twitching furiously, had become deeply, profoundly suspicious. He knew his mother's plumbing, while old, was fundamentally sound and well-maintained. He'd personally arranged for it to be inspected and snaked by a trusted plumber just a year prior as a preventative measure. He started paying much closer, more covert attention. He noticed Ms. Vogel, or sometimes her equally unpleasant silent husband, loitering near their property line with increasing frequency, sometimes peering intently at the side of Eleanor's house, where the main sewer cleanout access point was located. He began to hear faint, unusual gurgling sounds from Eleanor's drains, an occasional slow flush that hadn't been there before. He tried to dismiss it as paranoia, as his imagination working overtime due to the stress of Vogel's relentless campaign, but the gnawing unease grew stronger by the day. Finally, unable to shake the feeling, he discreetly installed a small weatherproof motion-activated security camera, positioning it carefully to cover the side yard and crucially the area around the sewer access point. He told himself it was just for peace of mind, a prudent precaution. He never truly believed it would capture anything so overtly criminal. And now this unimaginable abomination, this unspeakable, soul-destroying violation. As David helped his mother, now wrapped in a warm blanket from his car and safely, if dazedly ensconced in the passenger seat, he felt a cold, methodical, almost glacial fury begin to replace the initial shock and panic. He called emergency services, not 911, but the direct priority line to the city's hazardous materials, containment and sanitation systems, emergency response unit, his own department, his own people. He identified himself curtly, his voice tight, with fiercely controlled rage, and requested an immediate Level 1 biohazard containment and full forensic investigation team be dispatched to his mother's address. He also called the police, reporting a suspected act of deliberate, malicious property destruction and potential criminal endangerment of an elderly individual. Then, as he waited with his shivering mother for the various crews to arrive, his mind already working rapidly through containment protocols, evidence preservation chains, and potential legal ramifications, he remembered the camera. With fingers that still trembled slightly, not from cold, but from adrenaline and suppressed rage, he pulled out his phone connected to the camera's secure cloud feed and began to rewind the footage from the past 24 hours. His breath caught painfully in his throat. Their time-stamped at precisely 3:17 a.m. under the pale, ghostly glow of a distant streetlight was a figure, Ms. Henrietta Vogel, dressed in dark, form-fitting clothing, a dark knit cap pulled low, a disposable medical mask obscuring the lower half of her face, but her distinctive stiff gait. Her height, the sharp, determined set of her shoulders were utterly unmistakable. She was at the sewer cleanout cap on his mother's property line, a heavy industrial-grade pipe wrench clutched in her gloved hand. The footage showed her working, with focused effort for several minutes, then moving stealthily to what looked like a covered municipal sewer junction box further down the slight incline of the street. The nighttime footage wasn't perfectly clear on the exact mechanics of what she was doing, but her intent was horrifyingly, undeniably clear. She was tampering with the sewage system, deliberately, maliciously, with premeditated, catastrophic intent. The midpoint twist, the sickening lurch in David's stomach, wasn't just the shocking discovery of the incriminating footage, it was the devastating, brutal collision of his personal and professional worlds. The vague, nagging unease he'd felt about Vogel's earlier, seemingly abstract complaints about plumbing and infrastructure now crystallized into a horrifying absolute certainty. She hadn't just been complaining, she'd been meticulously planning. She'd been strategically laying the groundwork, creating a false narrative for this very atrocity. And he, David Henderson, Sanitation Systems Enforcement Lead for the city of Oak Haven, the senior official, ultimately responsible for ensuring the integrity, safety, and lawful operation of the very systems Vogel had just so monstrously weaponized, had it all recorded in irrefutable digital detail. He was no longer just a distraught, furious son fighting for his victimized mother. He was now, by default and by duty, the primary investigator and key expert witness in a major case of environmental sabotage, reckless endangerment, and aggravated elder abuse. A cold, clear, unwavering sense of purpose settled over him, displacing the chaos of his earlier emotions. Henrietta Vogel was about to discover the full, unmitigated, and inescapable weight of the laws she had so contemptuously, so cruelly broken. The flashing red and blue lights of the emergency response vehicles cast an eerie, strobing, almost apocalyptic glow on the surreal, nightmarish scene. Hazmat crews looking like astronauts in their full white protective suits and respirators were already efficiently deploying absorbent containment booms around the perimeter of Eleanor's property, their movements practiced and precise. Uniformed police officers were stringing yellow crime scene tape cordoning off the area, their faces grim and set as they tried to keep curious, shocked neighbors at bay. David, after ensuring Eleanor was being attended to by paramedics in a waiting ambulance, more for shock distress and potential exposure than any immediate visible physical injury, though he insisted on a full hospital checkup, just in case, approached the senior police officer in charge, Detective Miller, a burly, seen-it-all veteran with tired eyes, whom David had worked with on several complex cross-departmental cases involving illegal industrial dumping and major contamination incidents in the past. Miller David said, his voice low, hard, and devoid of its usual warmth. This wasn't an accident. This was deliberate. Miller, a man not easily surprised, looked at him then, at the horrifying sewage-filled house, then back at David's face, which was drawn pale and etched with a cold fury beneath the flashing emergency lights. Figured as much, Henderson. The sheer volume, the calculated totality of it. This is deeply malicious. You got any immediate ideas who'd do something this sick? I do, David said, his voice flat. He held out his smartphone. I have footage, security camera, time-stamped. Eleanor Vogel, the HOA president, lives 3 doors down. Shows her actively tampering with the sewer line access on my mother's property at approximately 3:17 this morning. Detective Miller's eyes widened significantly as he watched the damning playback on David's phone. Son of a bitch, he breathed, whistling softly, a rare sign of shock from the stoic detective. That's unbelievably brazen and incredibly profoundly dangerous. Does she have any earthly idea who you are? Henderson. Professionally, I mean your actual role with the city. David shook his head, a grim, mirthless smile touching his lips for a fleeting moment. I highly doubt it, Miller. To her, I'm just Eleanor's somewhat argumentative son, the annoying guy who keeps challenging her on rose bushes and furnace regulations. His smile vanished. She's about to get a very rude, very thorough awakening. You're the city's lead on all this sanitation infrastructure stuff, right? The big boss of sanitation enforcement, Miller asked, though his tone suggested he already knew the answer, the pieces clicking into place. That's correct, Detective David confirmed, his voice like ice. Which means this isn't just felony property damage. This is a deliberate act of environmental sabotage, willful contamination of a residential dwelling with significant quantities of biohazardous waste, reckless endangerment of public health, not to mention the clear and egregious elder abuse aspect, given my mother's age, her health, and her vulnerability. He listed the potential felony charges calmly, his voice devoid of any discernible emotion, each word precise, laden with professional weight. Miller nodded slowly, his expression grim. She's looking at very serious felony charges, Henderson. Multiple counts, especially with this crystal clear footage and your pending expert testimony. We'll need an official copy of that recording, of course, and your formal detailed statement. We'll go pay Ms. Vogel a little visit right now, see what she has to say for herself. I'll be there. David set his jaw tight. Not just as Eleanor's son, though, that part of me is screaming for a very different kind of retribution, but as the lead investigator for the city of Oakhaven in this matter. This falls squarely within my jurisdiction too, Miller. I want to see her face with my own eyes when she finally realizes the full extent of what she's done, and more importantly, who she's done it to. The scene at Ms. Vogel's imposing sterile modern house was almost anticlimactic in its initial jarring mundanity. She answered the door after a short delay, wrapped in an expensive-looking silk dressing gown, a look of mild, carefully curated surprise on her face that quickly hardened into visible annoyance when she saw the police uniforms, and then David standing slightly behind Detective Miller, his expression cold, unreadable, and utterly implacable. "Detectives, Mr. Henderson." Her voice was cool, perfectly modulated, yet laced with an unmistakable undercurrent of haughty impatience. To what do I owe this rather late and somewhat dramatic nocturnal visit? Has poor Eleanor had another one of her unfortunate episodes? Perhaps she left a tap running. Miller didn't waste any time on pleasantries. Ms. Vogel, we're here to discuss a major incident that occurred earlier this evening at Eleanor Henderson's property. A significant catastrophic sewage flood. We have compelling reason to believe it was deliberately caused. Vogel's perfectly sculpted eyebrows arched high on her forehead. Deliberately? By whom? That's utterly preposterous. It's far more likely her ancient neglected plumbing finally gave way. I've been warning the HOA board for months, for years, about the precarious state of the aging infrastructure in these older homes. Perhaps now they'll finally listen to reason. She exuded an almost palpable aura of smug, "I told you so" vindication. "We have security camera footage, Miss Vogel," David said then, his voice quiet, but carrying an undeniable weight of authority that cut through her condescending tone. "High-resolution footage of you at approximately 3:17 a.m. this morning at the main sewer cleanout access point on my mother's property, and then again moments later at a downstream municipal sewer junction box, tampering with the lines with tools. For the first time, a visible flicker of something, genuine unease, a shadow of fear, crossed Vogel's usually impassive face. But she recovered with astonishing speed, her mask of composure snapping back into place. "That's utterly absurd. I was in bed asleep. Your camera, if it even exists, must be mistaken or malfunctioning." Or perhaps she added a nasty, insinuating smile playing on her thin lips. "You're desperately trying to deflect blame for your own mother's gross negligence, Mr. Henderson, trying to find a scapegoat for failing infrastructure. It's very clear, irrefutable footage," Ms. Vogel. Detective Miller said, his voice hardening perceptibly, his patience clearly wearing thin. "And Mr. Henderson here, as you may or may not be aware, isn't just Eleanor's son. He's the city of Oakhaven's Sanitation Systems Enforcement Lead, the head of the department. He knows a thing or two about how these complex systems work, and more importantly, how they can be deliberately, maliciously sabotaged to cause exactly this kind of damage." The color drained visibly dramatically from Ms. Vogel's face. Her eyes, suddenly wide and darting, flew from Miller's stern visage to David's cold, accusing stare, then back again, a dawning, sickening horror blooming in their depths. Sanitation Systems Enforcement Lead. The title, the official designation, hung in the air between them, heavy, ominous, and utterly devastating. She opened her mouth as if to speak, then closed it again, a choked, gurgling sound escaping her throat. She was speechless, perhaps, for the first time in her meticulously controlled adult life. The smugness, the arrogance, the condescending superiority, all of it vanished in an instant, replaced by a stark, visceral, almost animalistic fear. She finally truly understood. She hadn't just picked a petty fight with a grieving son, protecting his elderly, vulnerable mother. She had committed a series of serious environmental crimes endangering public health, and the chief enforcer of those very laws, the ultimate authority on such matters in the entire city, was standing on her pristine doorstep, his own mother, her primary victim. Her carefully constructed world was imploding. Henrietta Vogel. Detective Miller said, his voice devoid of any sympathy, resonant with the full weight of the law, "You are under arrest for aggravated criminal mischief, multiple counts of environmental sabotage, reckless endangerment of public health, and felony elder abuse. The climax of the immediate situation wasn't a dramatic chase or a violent physical confrontation. It was the quiet, swift, and utterly devastating implosion of Henrietta Vogel's meticulously ordered world. As the cold steel of the handcuffs clicked shut around her slender wrists, her carefully constructed facade of civic righteousness and superior standing crumbled completely, revealing the petty, vindictive, and profoundly malicious core beneath. Her composure shattered. She began to babble incoherently, protesting her innocence, then wildly trying to blame David, accusing him of framing her, of abusing his position. Then she shrieked, "You're rigging this. You're all in on it. This is a conspiracy to destroy me because I expect standards." She made a sudden, desperate lunge towards the interior of her house, as if to retrieve something, or perhaps to barricade herself inside, but Miller and his partner were too quick, restraining her firmly. Her voice grew increasingly shrill, desperate, and unhinged as they escorted her struggling and shouting to the waiting patrol car. David watched his face, a mask of cold, professional detachment, even as a grim, profound sense of justice, hard-won and bitterly necessary, settled deep within him. This was just the beginning of her long and unavoidable reckoning. The falling action began in earnest the next morning. News of Vogel's arrest and the horrific, almost unbelievable nature of her crime against Eleanor Henderson spread through Willow Creek Estates and the wider Oak Haven community like a toxic shockwave. The HOA board convened an emergency meeting that very evening, from which they summarily and unanimously voted to remove Vogel from her presidency, strip her of her HOA membership entirely, and publicly condemn her actions in the strongest possible terms pending the outcome of the legal proceedings. Residents, many of whom had been cowed into fearful silence by Vogel's previous reign of terror and her vindictive use of HOA rules, emerged one by one with their own harrowing stories of her bullying tactics, her intrusive surveillance, her manipulations, and her petty personal vendettas against anyone who dared to cross her or didn't fit her narrow, rigid vision of aesthetic perfection. The collective picture that emerged was not of a dedicated, if overzealous, community leader, but of a deeply disturbed, controlling, and dangerously narcissistic individual who had systematically abused her position to harass, intimidate, and inflict misery upon her neighbors. The cleanup of Eleanor's small, beloved house was a monumental, heartbreaking task. Specialized hazmat teams contracted by the city and supervised by David's own department worked for days on end, pumping out contaminated water, shoveling out tons of putrid sludge, and removing mountains of debris. Carpets, furniture, flooring, sections of drywall, appliances, practically anything and everything touched by the raw sewage had to be meticulously stripped out, cataloged for insurance and evidence, and disposed of as biohazardous waste. Cherished personal belongings, irreplaceable mementos of a lifetime, photographs, letters, books, handmade quilts, his father's old armchair, were lost forever, casualties of Vogel's calculated malice. The financial cost of the remediation and eventual restoration was staggering, projected to run into 6 figures. But the emotional toll on Eleanor was even greater, immeasurable. She stayed with David, of course, in his small, tidy apartment, but she was a fragile shadow of her former self, listless, withdrawn, often weeping silently, haunted by the vivid memory of the violation of her home, the loss of her sanctuary, the desecration of her memories. She spoke often in a low, trembling voice of the smell, a phantom stench that seemed to cling to her clothes, to her hair, even in David's spotlessly clean, untouched apartment, a constant, tormenting reminder. David, meanwhile, threw himself with a cold, focused intensity into building the ironclad legal and technical case against Vogel. As Sanitation Systems Enforcement Lead, he meticulously documented every single aspect of the environmental sabotage. He personally supervised the careful excavation and forensic examination of the affected sewer lines, identifying with chilling precision the exact sophisticated method Vogel had employed. A custom-made temporary bypass valve, meticulously installed on the main line, combined with a strategically placed, expandable industrial-grade plug, a combination designed to divert the entire upstream street's wastewater flow directly and exclusively into his mother's private lateral line, while simultaneously blocking her own outflow to the now bypassed municipal main. It was a diabolically clever, technically proficient, and utterly malicious piece of amateur malevolent engineering. He collected multiple sworn statements from the hazmat crews, the first responding officers, and the paramedics. He compiled exhaustive reports on the environmental impact, the public health risks, the extent of the contamination, and the specific municipal and state codes violated. His expertise was undeniable, his evidence irrefutable and overwhelming. Vogel, out on a hefty bail secured by mortgaging her monstrosity of a house, hired a notoriously aggressive, high-powered defense attorney, a man known for his scorched earth tactics. The lawyer immediately went on the offensive, attempting to discredit David personally and professionally, brazenly claiming he was abusing his official position to pursue a personal vendetta against a respected community leader. The lawyer argued that the security footage was grainy, inconclusive, and open to misinterpretation, that Ms. Vogel, if it was indeed her, was merely inspecting what she reasonably believed to be a public utility easement due to her concerns about aging infrastructure. He even had the audacity to suggest that the catastrophic sewage flood was in fact a tragic accident caused by decades of neglected city infrastructure for which David himself, as the city's Sanitation Enforcement Lead, should logically bear some professional responsibility. Vogel even attempted a desperate counter-move. She filed a flimsy anonymous complaint with the City Ethics Board accusing David of professional misconduct. It was swiftly dismissed due to lack of evidence, but it was a clear sign of her escalating desperation. She also, through a third party, attempted to offer David a substantial cash settlement to make this all go away, an offer he rejected with cold contempt. This aggressive defense strategy backfired spectacularly. David, with the full and unwavering backing of the city attorney's office, his own department, and indeed the mayor's office, who were appalled by the incident, presented his meticulously compiled evidence with calm, unwavering, devastating precision at a series of preliminary hearings. He explained the complex workings of the municipal sewer system with effortless clarity, demonstrated with detailed diagrams, scaled models, and even hydraulic flow calculations exactly how Vogel had executed her sophisticated sabotage. He detailed the specific multiple state and local environmental protection regulations she had egregiously violated, regulations he himself had helped draft, implement, or had been enforcing for years. He was not just a grieving, angry son. He was the ultimate unshakable expert witness and authority in his field. Vogel's lawyers' blustering arguments and desperate insinuations crumbled into dust under the sheer weight of David's unassailable technical knowledge and the stark, damning reality of the crystal-clear video footage. The Willow Creek Estates community, utterly shocked by the defense's audacity and deeply sympathetic to Eleanor's horrific plight, rallied around her with unexpected warmth and generosity. Neighbors organized online fundraisers and local bake sales to help with the astronomical rebuilding costs. A respected local contractor himself, a longtime resident and disgusted by Vogel's actions, offered to oversee and conduct the entire restoration work on Eleanor's house at his exact cost, waiving all profit. People brought comforting meals to David's apartment, for Eleanor offered companionship, shared their own previously suppressed stories of unpleasant encounters and petty tyrannies they had endured under Vogel, creating a powerful bond of shared experience and a renewed sense of community spirit that Vogel, in her quest for absolute control, had nearly extinguished. At one particularly contentious HOA meeting, where Vogel's actions were being discussed, Vogel herself was not present on advice of counsel. Mr. Henderson, the elderly board member, finally spoke up more forcefully. I told him she had trouble up north. Word was, she and her first husband lost their business, their home, everything in that big river flood. Insurance didn't cover it all. They blamed the city, blamed their neighbors for not maintaining levees. He left her not long after. She came here with a chip on her shoulder the size of a boulder, obsessed with order, obsessed with things not falling apart. Doesn't excuse this, not one bit, but maybe it explains some of the darkness in her. His words didn't lessen the condemnation of Vogel, but they added a layer of tragic, twisted context to her destructive pathology. The final resolution of Henrietta Vogel's criminal case came many agonizing months later. Faced with truly overwhelming, incontrovertible evidence, the prospect of a lengthy, publicly humiliating, and almost certainly losing trial, and the unwavering testimony of a chief city official as the primary victim's son and lead expert, She finally accepted a plea bargain on the eve of her trial. She pleaded guilty to multiple felony charges, including environmental sabotage, willful discharge of pollutants, and willful injury to an elder or dependent adult causing significant harm. The judge, a stern, no-nonsense woman who seemed visibly angered and disgusted by the calculated cruelty and profound impact of the crimes detailed in the pre-sentencing report, sentenced Henrietta Vogel to the maximum allowable term under the plea agreement, 5 years. In state prison, though, with the possibility of parole after serving 3. She was also ordered to pay full and complete restitution for all damages to Eleanor's home, a sum that ultimately ran well into the hundreds of thousands of dollars, effectively bankrupting her. Her own stark modern house, the sterile monument to her arrogance and misplaced priorities, was sold at auction to cover her substantial legal fees and the initial restitution payments. Henrietta Vogel, stripped of her wealth, her power, her freedom, and her carefully curated reputation, became a pariah, a whispered cautionary tale in Oakhaven about the corrosive nature of unchecked malice and the ultimate folly of hubris. Eleanor's emotional and physical recovery was slow, painstaking. The physical restoration of her little blue house took nearly a full year. David, with the unwavering practical help of caring friends and supportive neighbors, oversaw every single detail, ensuring it was rebuilt, not just to current code, but with love, with attention to her comfort, trying to recapture some of the warmth, charm, and sense of security that had been so cruelly, so violently stripped away. They installed a state-of-the-art security system, including multiple cameras and a new, far more robust plumbing system, complete with multiple industrial-grade backflow preventers. A small, bitter irony that David, in his professional capacity, couldn't help but appreciate. When the house was finally ready, Eleanor was deeply hesitant, almost fearful to return. The traumatic memories of the flood, the filth, the violation were still vivid, raw, and tormenting. The phantom smell, she confessed to David, still sometimes plagued her in her dreams. But David gently, patiently encouraged her. He took extended leave from work and spent the first few weeks there with her around the clock, slowly, tenderly reintroducing her to her reclaimed, beautifully restored space. Neighbors visited often, not with morbid curiosity, but with genuine warmth, bringing flowers from their own gardens, freshly baked bread, and most importantly, their unwavering support and friendship. Slowly, tentatively, Eleanor began to heal. She started spending time in her garden again, carefully planting new roses to replace the ones that had been indirectly lost in the chaos and contamination. The delicate sound of her wind chimes, once a ridiculous point of contention for Vogel, now seemed to sing a soft, clear song of resilience and quiet defiance in the gentle Elm Street breeze. One bright, sunny afternoon, many months after Eleanor had moved back in for good, David, visiting for their now reinstated Tuesday dinner, found her sitting peacefully on her newly rebuilt porch swing, a steaming cup of her favorite Earl Grey tea. In her hand, a contented expression on her face, as she watched a group of neighborhood children playing a boisterous game of tag on the sidewalk in front of her house. A genuine warm smile touched her lips, the first truly joyful, unclouded smile he'd seen reach her eyes in a long, painful time. "It's so good to hear their laughter on the street again, isn't it, dear?" she said softly, her gaze following a little girl with bright red pigtails who shrieked with delight as she narrowly avoided being tagged. "For a long while there, after that, I truly thought all the joy, all the good had been washed away forever." David sat down beside her on the swing, taking her small, still strong hand in his. "It takes a lot more than a disgusting flood of filth to wash away real joy, Mom, especially yours." He squeezed her hand gently. "Some things are too strong, too deep to be destroyed by malice." The fight had been grueling. The emotional scars on both of them were deep and would likely never fully fade. But they had endured. Justice, though slow, arduous, and at times agonizingly frustrating, had ultimately been served. Henrietta Vogel's reign of terror was definitively over her name now, a local synonym for petty cruelty, obsessive control, and ultimate ignominious self-destruction. The Willow Creek Estates community, forged and tempered in the crucible of shared adversity and collective outrage, was stronger, more compassionate, more vigilant, and more genuinely connected than it had ever been under Vogel's divisive leadership. Eleanor Henderson, a quiet, unassuming symbol of remarkable resilience and gentle strength, had reclaimed her home, her peace of mind, and her cherished place in a neighborhood that had finally, through shared trauma and subsequent kindness, learned the true, enduring meaning of community, not in enforced, sterile conformity and superficial perfection, but in genuine kindness, mutual support, and the shared, simple celebration of everyday life, imperfections and all. David Henderson continued his demanding work as the City of Oak Haven's Sanitation Systems Enforcement Lead, his already strong resolve and commitment to public service now deeply personally reinforced by the harrowing ordeal his mother had endured. He knew with a clarity few could possess the profound, often unacknowledged importance of the unseen, unglamorous systems that kept a city alive, healthy, and functional, and the constant vigilance required to protect those systems from neglect, decay, and, as he now knew all too well, from those who would maliciously abuse them for their own twisted ends. He also knew with a depth of feeling that brought tears to his eyes when he thought of it, the profound, unwavering strength of a mother's enduring love, a son's fierce devotion, and a community's remarkable healing capacity for compassion and renewal. The sickening stench of that terrible violating day would likely never fully leave his memory, a faint, acrid ghost in the recesses of his mind. But it was now increasingly overlaid with the sweeter, more enduring, life-affirming scent of his mother's new roses blooming defiantly and beautifully in her reclaimed garden, a vibrant, fragrant testament to the enduring power of life, to reclaim, to rebuild, and to bloom again with renewed vigor, even in the devastating wake of a seemingly catastrophic flood. The experience had left an indelible, sobering mark, a grim first-hand understanding of the insidious darkness that could lurk beneath even the most placid, ordinary suburban surface. But it had also, more importantly, illuminated with brilliant clarity the unwavering, resilient light of human decency, the profound strength found in solidarity, and the quiet, enduring, and ultimately triumphant victory of good over a particularly vile and calculated form of evil.